Now we are going to look at the aftermath of World War I and the established foreign policy of the 1920s. During the war, Woodrow Wilson never lost sight of his ambition to shape the peace settlement when the war ended. In January of 1917, he had said that the United States would insist on peace without victory. A year later, he presented to Congress a detailed list of war aims known as the 14 Points, designed to address the causes of World War I and prevent another world war. Several of the president's 14 points related to specific territorial questions. For example, Germany had to return certain regions of France and to evacuate Belgium in the west and Romania and Serbia in the east. Of greater significance were the following broad principles for securing the peace. 1. Recognition of freedom of the seas. 2. An end to the practice of making secret treaties. 3. Reduction of national armaments. 4. An impartial adjustment of all colonial claims. 5. Self-determination for the various nationalities. 6. Removal of trade barriers. And 7. And lastly, a general association of nations for the purpose of affording mutual guarantees of political independence and territorial integrity of the great and small states alike. That last point was the one that Wilson valued the most. The International Peace Association that he envisioned would soon be named the League of Nations. The peace conference following the armistice took place in the Palace of Versailles outside Paris, beginning in January 1919. Every nation that had fought on the Allied side in the war was represented. No U.S. president had ever traveled abroad to attend a diplomatic conference, but President Wilson decided that his personal participation at Versailles was vital to defending his 14 points. Republicans criticized him for being accompanied to Paris by several Democrats, but only one Republican, whose advice was never sought. Other heads of state at Versailles made it clear that their nations wanted both revenge against Germany and compensation in the form of indemnities and territory. They did not share Wilson's idealism, which called for a peace without victory. David Lloyd George of Great Britain and those leading France and Italy met with Wilson almost daily as the Big Four. After months of arguments, the president reluctantly agreed to compromise on most of his 14 points. He insisted, however, that the other delegations accept his plan for a League of Nations. When the peace conference adjourned in June 1919, the Treaty of Versailles included the following terms. 1. Germany was disarmed and stripped of its colonies in Asia and Africa. It was also forced to admit guilt for the war, accept French occupation of the Rhineland for 15 years, and pay a huge sum of money in reparations to Great Britain and France. 2. Applying the principle of self-determination, territories once controlled by Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Russia were taken by the Allies. Independence was granted to Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Finland, and Poland, and the new nations of Czechoslovakia and Yugoslavia were established. And 3, signers of the treaty would join an international peacekeeping organization, the League of Nations. Article 10 of the Covenant of the League called for each member nation to stand ready to protect the independence and territorial integrity of other nations. Returning to the United States, President Wilson had to win approval of 2/3 of the Senate for all parts of the Treaty of Versailles, including the League of Nations Covenant. Republican senators raised objections to the League, especially to Article 10, arguing that U.S. membership in such a body might interfere with U.S. sovereignty and might also cause European nations to interfere in the Western Hemisphere, which of course is a strict violation of the Monroe Doctrine. Wilson made winning Senate ratification difficult. In October 1918, he had asked voters to support Democrats in the midterm elections as an act of patriotic loyalty. This political appeal had backfired badly. In the 1918 election, Republicans had won a solid majority in the House and a majority of two of the Senate. In 1919, Wilson needed Republican votes in the Senate to ratify the Treaty of Versailles. Instead, he faced the determined hostility of a leading Senate Republican, Henry Cabot Lodge. Senators opposed to the Treaty of Versailles formed two groups. The irreconcilable faction could not accept U.S. membership in the League, no matter how the covenant was worded. The reservationist faction, a larger group led by Senator Lodge, said they could accept the League if certain reservations were added to the covenant. Wilson had the option of either accepting Lodge's reservations or fighting for the treaty as it stood. He decided to fight. Believing that his policy could prevail if he could personally rally public support, Wilson boarded a train and went on an arduous speaking tour to the West to make speeches for the League of Nations. On September 25, 1919, he collapsed after delivering a speech in Colorado. He returned to Washington and a few days later suffered a massive stroke with which he never fully recovered. The Senate defeated the treaty without reservation. When it came up with reservations, the ailing Wilson directed his Senate allies to reject the compromise, and they joined with the irreconcilables in defeating the treaty a second time. After Wilson left office in 1921, the United States officially made peace with Germany. It never ratified the Versailles Treaty nor joined the League of Nations. Americans had trouble adjusting from the patriotic fervor of wartime to the economic and social stresses of post-war uncertainties. During the war, 4 million American men had been taken from civilian life and the domestic economy. Not all the returning soldiers could find jobs right away, but many who did took employment from the women and African Americans who, for a short time, had thrived on war work. The business boom of wartime also went flat as factory orders for war production fell off. With European farm products back on the market, farm prices fell, which hurt U.S. farmers. In the cities, consumers went on a buying spree, leading to inflation and a short boom in 1920. The spree did not last. In 1921, business plunged into a recession and 10% of the American workforce was unemployed. In 1919, the country suffered from a volatile combination of unhappiness with the peace process, fears of communism fueled by the communist takeover in Russia, and worries about labor unrest at home. The anti-German hysteria of the war years turned quickly into an anti-communist hysteria known as the Red Scare. These anti-racial fears also fueled xenophobia that resulted in restrictions on immigration in the 1920s. A series of unexplained bombings caused Attorney General A. Mitchell Palmer to establish a special office under J. Edgar Hoover to gather information on radicals. Palmer also ordered mass arrests of anarchists, socialists, and labor agitators. From November 1919 through January 1920, over 6,000 people were arrested based on limited criminal evidence. Most of the suspects were foreign-born, and 500 of them, including the outspoken radical Emma Goldman, were deported. The scare faded almost as quickly as it arose. Palmer warned of huge riots on May Day, 1920, but they never took place. His loss of credibility, coupled with rising concerns about civil liberties, caused the hysteria to recede. In a nation that valued free enterprise and rugged individualism, a large part of the American public regarded unions with distrust. Their anti-union attitudes softened during the Progressive Era. Factory workers and their unions were offered a square deal under Theodore Roosevelt and protection from lawsuits under the Clayton Antitrust Act of 1914. During the war, unions made important gains. In the post-war period, however, a series of strikes in 1919, as well as fear of revolution, turned public opinion against unions. The first major strike in 1919 was in Seattle in February. Some 6,000 unionists joined shipyard workers in a peaceful strike for higher pay. Troops were called out, but there was no violence. In Boston in September, police went on strike to protest the firing of a few police officers who tried to unionize. Massachusetts Governor Calvin Coolidge sent in the National Guard to break the strike. Also in September, workers for the U.S. Steel Corporation struck. State and federal troops were called out, and after considerable violence, the strike was broken in January of 1920. The migration of African Americans to northern cities during the war increased racial tensions. Whites resented the increased competition for jobs and housing. During the war, race riots had erupted, the largest in East St. Louis, Illinois in 1917. In 1919, racial tensions led to violence in many cities. The worst riot was in Chicago, where 40 people were killed and 500 were injured. Conditions were no better in the South, as racial prejudice and fears of returning African American soldiers led to an increase in racial violence and lynchings by whites. During the 1920s, widespread disillusionment with World War I, Europe's post-war problems, and communism in the Soviet Union made Americans fearful of being pulled into another foreign war. But despite the U.S. refusal to join the League of Nations, the makers of U.S. foreign policy did not retreat to the isolationism of the Gilded Age. Instead, they actively pursued arrangements to foreign affairs that would advance American interests while also maintaining world peace. So let's look at the essential question. You are to analyze how the Washington Conference of 1921 and the Kellogg-Briand Pact, while attempting to promote peace and scale back our defense expenditures, led to widespread threats to democracy throughout Europe and another full-scale war. Be sure to use your evidence for support.